All right, we're going to get started. For those in the back, can you hear me? Yes? Okay? All right. So we're going to talk about content architecture today. And it's the 10th anniversary of Bad Camp, so I have a space theme to go along with Bad Camp X. My name is Kristen. I'm at Hook 42, and I've been doing Drupal for a long time, since 2004, and tech since the .com days, for those who are old enough to know what that means. So before we get started, I'd like to find out kind of who's in the room. So who would consider themselves a developer? Wow, okay, almost everybody. And architect? Okay, there's a few. Site builder? A lot of you. Themer? Oh, quite a few, all right. And who's more on the newbie side of things? All right, couple. And intermediate, few, and advanced. All right, so the advanced people are going to come up and they're going to join the conversation up here. Awesome. Okay, so like I said, it's Bad Camp X, 10th anniversary, so we've got a space theme going on. So in that vein, we're going to try to talk a little bit about maybe a site that we would want to build. We're really into outer space stuff, and we like comic books along that theme. And, you know, we have a collection of the Space Cadet comic books. So we looked in the domain outerspacecadets.com is not owned. So we're going to build a new site with that theme. So that website's going to have some pages which are talking about celestial bodies. You know, we'll have things on planets and things like that. And it's going to be, you know, fairly structured content. We're going to have the name of the celestial body and have some description and maybe some coordinates and that kind of thing. We're also going to want to have a media gallery with all our fun pictures of aliens and, you know, pre-solar systems and that kind of stuff. And, you know, we have a marketing department to try to sell our fun outer space themed things. So, but the marketing department, they never know what they want to show. They want to do sort of flexible stuff. Sometimes they want to show, you know, 3 columns here and a full column there, that kind of thing, and throw up an image and text and rearrange stuff, and we kind of don't ever know what they want to do. But we're going to do ads. We're going to have some ads on the site and be able to focus that and, you know, be able to place those ads throughout the site in different positions. So we want to have these smaller pieces of content sprinkled throughout the site. But we're thinking that we want to do something kind of cool. We're going to have a UFO sighting database. And we'll invite people from around the world to put in their information and say, oh yeah, I saw this cool thing, I don't know what it was. And, you know, give the location and their name and what they saw, maybe some pictures about it, that kind of thing. So we're going to have fun and build this stuff. So this is not unlike all the projects we do, right? There's a bunch of different types of content we want to be able to put together. You know, the client or the university or whoever, or maybe it's for ourselves. We think about all these different things that we want to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about terminology. So I intentionally called this talk content architecture. I did not call it content strategy. I did not call it content modeling. There's lots of things that, you know, we could talk about. And these all mean different things to different people. So I'll kind of explain what I think these things mean. They might have a little bit different flavor for you. When I think content strategy, I think big. I think social media. I think SEO, I think marketing, and stuff going on outside the website, inside the website, how that's all interrelated. It's a really big thing. When I think content modeling, I think more kind of like, oh, I want this field and that field, and these things are related to each other, and it's a little more databasey, right? I've got my, this content type, and it's related to this one, and that sort of thing. So that's when I think of content modeling, that's kind of what I think. For this talk, I wanted to talk a little bit more architecture from like a technical point of view. What kind of modules are you going to be using? What kind of things are in Drupal already that you could use for content? So it's a little more of the Drupal architecture and what kind of tools you have available to you and how you might do your modeling, how you might do your content strategy, but it's a little more of the nuts and bolts of the things that you would use. So to start with, we'll just go high level with Drupal 7 and 8. And here are some terms that you've probably heard, some of you, the newbies maybe not as much. But at the very high level, Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 aren't that much different if you just kind of go up top. So, and we'll go into each one of these buckets a little bit. So pretty much, if you look side by side at the big picture, they're pretty similar. There's something that we'll talk about, which is entity variants, which isn't quite the same. So in Drupal 7, they introduced this idea of entities. Before Drupal 7, we had nodes, and then everybody tried to make everything a node that wasn't a node, a user a node, this a node of that. It was like, oh, because they wanted the field. So in 7, they said, okay, well, let's make entities, and they started to go that route. And they made some things entities, but not everything entities. So we have nodes and terms and some things. In Drupal 8, they extended that completely, and now pretty much everything's an entity. But they have two flavors of entities. So you have configuration entities and content entities. Content entities are very similar to what we have in Drupal 7. It's just that there's more of them. So, nodes and terms and things. The thing that's different is there's this configuration entity, which is part of Drupal 8, which is not really a concept in previous versions of Drupal. So then we have entity types, and they're in those buckets of either a configuration entity or content entity. And so we see that for Drupal 8, we've extended the content entities quite a bit. So now we have, block content is a content entity, menu links, shortcuts. I mean, the list is quite long. So we were fairly limited in Drupal 7, but we have more options in Drupal 8. And there's something called a property, and it sounds like most everyone's intermediate or advanced, so probably a lot of you know this distinction, but a property is a little bit different than a field. So a property is something like the node ID or the type of entity, and that from a database point of view is actually stored usually within the actual entity table itself rather than having multiple field tables throughout the database. There's a field data and field revision table. They actually moved some of the properties. This threw me off a little bit. I was looking for all the properties in 8 to compare them to 7. I was like, where'd they put the properties? So there's actually something called, I think it's node field data, which has a bunch of properties in it, which is, I think, a little confusing because it's not quite a field. But so they're pretty similar. The most interesting difference that I noticed was they've, in Drupal 8, they have UUIDs, which is this unique identifier that you could get in Drupal 7, but you had to use an add-on module, a contrib module for that. And as far as Drupal fields go, we've used fields all the time. That's something that you can add on, special fields for your content. In Drupal core, they've added a lot more of them in core. So this is just the core fields. And so some of the common ones that you would add in Drupal 7, like entity reference and things like that, have been moved into Drupal core so that you don't have to add on extra modules. So at the end of the day, there's all these entities that you can have, a node, a user, a comment, a term, and you have instances of those entities, of those objects, instances of those, so of those classes. So in Drupal 7, these were sort of object-oriented. I mean, there was a class, but it was just sort of this generic class. In Drupal 8, these things are very concrete. So they're type classes. So there's a term one and a node one and comment and that sort of thing. And those extend from all these base classes that if you were going to make your own, you could do as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the big picture of these different things and how we might use them. And that some of this plays into content strategy and content modeling and everything, but whenever you're trying to decide what kind of technology you're going to do, what kind of modules you're going to use and implement, you need to understand, who are you building this for? What do they need? And some of that's not just who your end audience, who's going to come and buy our, space themed products or whatever, but who's going to be entering? Who's our marketing department? Are they tech savvy? Can we make something that's maybe a little bit cool and interesting and maybe a little harder to learn, but it's okay because they can figure it out, or we can teach them? Or no, they need something super, super simple and just keep it really straightforward. So you need to know who your internal and external audiences are. And I'm sure you've heard it before, you want to try as much as possible to separate your presentation from your content. So that means the layout of the thing isn't tied in with, the thing itself. You want to make sure that you try to separate those things out. Sometimes it gets a little bit tricky. For those of you, I'm sure a lot of people have used panels before. Sometimes you start adding content within panel panes and things, and then you're kind of, you're a little bit taking the presentation with the content. So as much as you can pull those apart, the better. So, and then using structured content. So probably a lot of people have heard of the blob for the body field, right? Don't have that body field be this big blob of stuff with a big WYSIWYG on it, and you could just, whatever, just go have fun, do what you want, have a bunch of buttons there or whatever. So you want to try to pull out and have fields that make sense. If there's an image that you want to be able to reuse, then you're going to pull out that image. If there's some summary text that you want to be able to reuse around the site, you would pull that out. So as far as reusing things, so something that's interesting between D7 and D8 is, we definitely encourage reusing fields as much as possible. There's sometimes when you can't do that because you're at a large university and they're reusing these features across the university, and they have to have namespaces because there's collisions between different features. So, you can't always try to reuse fields across, your content types and that sort of thing. But if you are able to do that, it's good. It's better for performance. It makes more sense when you're trying to show views of content coming across different types, and you can show an image and it's coming from different places and that sort of thing. And then there's this concept of reusing content called, create once, publish everywhere. And I think it came through from NPR originally, but I mean, it's a good, rule of thumb if you're able to try to, say you have article content type, and you want to be able to surface that article on different pages of your site, but you want to show different things. Maybe you have a long title, a short title, a small image, a big image, that sort of thing. But it's all part of the same form, and it lets the person who's creating the content, who knows about that content, to provide different, information about that, that article, and then that, on this page maybe it's showing the short title and the small image, and this page it's showing the longer title and that sort of thing. So the idea is to try to break things up and have, the editors have a lot of control over what will be seen, but then be able to place that information throughout the site or, sent to other places as well outside of the site. So, we want to do those things, but we also want to make sure that we don't have too many content types. So, and depending on the site, sometimes sites are huge and you end up with a fair number of content types. But if you're able to reuse content types, that's always a good thing too. So are these things similar enough? Are we able to collapse things down? Or can I make a flexible content type that kind of handles a lot of these edge cases? We don't want to have a crazy number of fields. The token module gets, unhappy if you have too many fields and it's trying to, figure out what tokens to show you in the little token finder, things like that. It's just, it's not great for performance. The kitchen sink WYSIWYG, right? I'm sure we've all seen it. Maybe we've even built it where there's this like 50 million WYSIWYG buttons. You don't even know what they all do, and it's just like, okay. Try not to give them too much control that they're just going to break the page. And on the other side, you don't necessarily want too few content types, because if you just kind of say, oh, well, here's a flexible content type, just do what you want. Well, what if you have structured content that you want to be able to show on certain pages, and you want to know what the image is and the short title, and be able to leverage that information, or maybe it's our UFO database and we want to know what location they were in, that kind of thing. So there's this balance, and it's a tricky thing, but not getting too little, try too constrained, but not too crazy with too many things. You should always be thinking about your content editor. Like I said before, are they tech savvy? Do they know, can you make things a little bit, more flexible because they can handle that? Or does it need to be really, really constrained because in really, really simple, and provide all the tools to help them do their job? And one last thing is misusing taxonomy. So we've done audits before where we open up the site and taxonomy is not used at all, which was kind of surprising. If you're not using taxonomy at all, that just seems a little interesting. And maybe there's a case for that, but it's, I think, pretty unusual. But sometimes people abuse taxonomy, and really they use it for something that should be a content type. So taxonomy in general, some people have a hard time wrapping their brain around it, but you want to use it for categorizing things. So colors, locations, things where it's like, okay, you could use that later and show related things. So I'm looking at my UFO database, and we've tagged it by geography, right? So it's North America, South America, whatever. And then I could say, oh, what other UFO sightings happen in this region? So you want to make sure that you're using it in a way that makes sense for your content. Okay, so I've kind of structured things into different buckets of types of things you might be building. The first one I'm calling big atomic content. So this is kind of big things that kind of stand alone. And I would say that for those, you're going to typically choose between either a content type or a custom entity. So you can make your own entities, and sometimes that makes sense. So a content type, I'm sure everybody in here has made a content type before, even the newbies. So who here has made a custom entity before? Oh, okay, quite a few. Okay, so does anyone have an example of a custom entity that they've done that would make sense to anybody? Throw out something? No, Bueller?
Representation of an object pulled from an external API.
Okay, so reading from some API and wanted to be able to represent that information within the Drupal database and show it somehow. Okay, so so there are lots of reasons why you might want to have a custom entity, and we'll go over some thoughts there. But what you can ask yourself when you're trying to struggle between should this be a content type or should this be a custom entity, is this thing content? Like, would you expect a content editor type person to go and type it in? Maybe then that's a good case for a content type. Does it need a URL? Well, that's often usually a good case for having a content type. Does it need a workflow or any of the things that you would normally use for nodes? Then again, that's maybe a good reason to use content type. But there are other reasons why you might not want to have a content type. So if you're reading some data from some external system and you want that information in your system, but you don't necessarily want to show it at a web page, but you're going to consume it in some way, that's a good reason. If it's some component of something that you're building, so maybe you're doing invoicing on your site and you have some sort of things that are sales data, sales information, but it's not really surfaced as its own individual thing, but it's sort of a component, then you might want to build those up as custom entities and then surface that information throughout the site. So in our example previously, when we're building this new outerspacecadets.com, we had some, these celestial body pages are going to have the name of the celestial body and have some information about them, maybe their size or that kind of thing. It's pretty structured data. And, I would argue that would be a good case for content type because we want a web page and it's very obvious, the kind of things that we're going to have in it. So that would be a good example. But our UFO database, are we going to show a sighting at an URL, or are we going to be able to have them search for this stuff? And for us, it's like, oh no, it's fine if we're just going to have some search page and they can search for these, and we don't have to surface the URL for each of the things. We don't necessarily care when someone edits it. Do we need to hook into this information on when someone edits or updates or views or that kind of thing? So for that one, that would probably be a good case of like, okay, we're going to have a custom entity and we can define all the fields in there or properties in that case in order to do that. Another good reason to go with an entity is performance. If you have a lot of data and you want to make sure that you're not going to tank your site, then that's a good reason to go with a custom entity. And you can use properties instead of fields if you want even more performance, because when you have a property, it's in the same table as the main entity table, but then once you're adding fields on, it's in the different tables, and you have to join all those things together when you're querying. So those are kind of big structured content. If you're going to make custom entities, you can just write the code, and in Drupal 7 you have the entity API, and Drupal 8 that's all built in. There's also something for the site builders. If you're not a coder and you want to be able to make custom entities, there's something called the Entity Creation Kit, and you can make entities through the UI. And it's very similar to just making content type. Okay. So now we'll talk a little bit about using media on your site, since everybody wants to do that. Who here has used the media module and related almost everyone, yeah. So there actually are some alternatives. Who uses something else besides the media module? Say?
We use Skull.
Skull, okay. Anyone else use something besides media?
Video embed field.
Video embed? Okay, so specifically for video, yeah. So very media specific things. Yeah, but I found this image and it was good in terms of the size comparison, but media is the big hitter, right? So we've got, this is the usage for the media module versus Scald and Asset, which were some of the competitors. So it's a lot of leverage there, a lot of people working on that. As far as in Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8, they've really re-architected it in Drupal 8. In Drupal 7, they had mainly media and file entity, and then there was some in the media module. There were some sub-modules that you could use in order to do what you wanted. They've really broken things out, and something interesting is like the entity browser, which is really cool because it works for any entity. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be a media entity. It could be anything. And then they've really made these media entities very granular now, so that you can pick and choose. You can make your own if you wanted to work within the media ecosystem. Now, even though media is still in dev, we've been using it, and it's been working okay. So the interesting about Drupal 8 is you'll find that even though things are in dev or alpha or beta, you can usually kind of get something that works. They haven't locked them down, but you can usually kind of, might have to throw a couple patches at it, but it's usually not too bad. So here's kind of, this came from the media initiative architecture. So we've got all these media items, and then you can extend that if you want to make your own custom one. So maybe you're reading from some external API and want to pull in media items from somewhere else. So if I were, going to build this outer space cadets.com, I would probably use the media module suite in order to build out our media gallery. Now I'm going to talk about something called small atomic content. So we have the big stuff, which is the content types and big custom entities, and now we can talk about small. So this is something that we might reuse throughout the site. So Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8, we had Drupal 7 had block. We had something called Bean. Who here has used Bean? Yeah, a few people. So Bean is blocks, entity, what are they? Let's see. Aren't nodes, block entities aren't nodes, yeah. So there's the Bean, which basically is like, just like when we were in Drupal 6 and we wanted to make a user a node because we wanted fields, then we're like, we'll make blocks kind of like nodes by using Bean so that we can add fields.
Can I ask a quick question? Would paragraphs fall into this category?
We'll talk about that later. Okay. Yeah. So the question was, does paragraphs fall into here? And you can. So we'll talk a little bit about some other subatomic things in a little bit. So this was something that you're going to, kind of stand alone, but kind of a smaller bit of content where we can use throughout the site. Now, I did put in fieldable panel panes, and really that's only used in different places if you're in the panels ecosystem, so it's a little bit different. But for Drupal 8, they did not. So fieldable panel panes allowed you in panels, add fields to things and then, reuse that information. They didn't port that to Drupal 8, and that was intentional because blocks basically, it was like, I can make a block, I can make block types just like content types, so I can go in and add that information and just use it. So why do I need to do this fieldable panel pane thing? So in our case, that would be a good, using that model of, fieldable blocks. would be a good case for having our ads, right? We have these little ad blocks that we use throughout the site. Maybe we have a title and an image and some little call to action or something like that. And we can use that kind of smaller atomic content throughout. So now I'll talk about something called subatomic. We got space and, subatomic, it's all kind of related. And this is where things get interesting. And so far, none of the stuff I've said is super controversial, I don't think. I think it's all pretty straightforward. We start getting, some of this stuff gets a little religious at this point. So who here has used field collection? Wow, like almost everybody. Who here has used paragraphs? Okay, fair number. How about ECK, the entity construction kit? Almost none. Oh, that's interesting. Just a little bit. All right. So there's different ways of kind of making small structures of content. And here are some of them. Field collections has been around for a long time. Most of the hands came up probably because a lot of us have been around for a long time, and so that was kind of a big player for many years. Then paragraphs came on the scene and kind of shook things up a little bit, which is interesting. We'll talk a little bit about that some more. But beyond those, you can still make your own custom stuff, right? So if you want to make, it was in Drupal 6, but I made a custom field which had multiple fields in it. So you could still get down and write code. But now the tools have gotten so good that really don't need to do that so much anymore. So let's talk a little bit about these. So a good use of these kind of subatomic structures is if you want to be able to have flexible content. And the idea is, instead of having that big body field with just the kitchen sink WYSIWYG and you just do whatever you want, we're going to say, okay, what do you want for that first little section? And people call these different things content rows, content areas, banded content, content slices. We hear a lot of different things. Basically, it's just like there's a section of content. You can define the fields for that and add one of those. And then you're going to add another thing, and it's going to have different fields. Add another one, add another one, add another one. Build up the page. And in this flexible manner that hopefully is easy for the content editor to do. So in Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8, have some stats here. The pipe, it's like D7, pipe D8 information. So field collection's been around the longest, 2010. Entity construction kit has been around since 2011, but it's not as popular. So we got the usage. One interesting thing is actually the paragraphs in D8 is a full release, though their D7 is at RC, which I thought was kind of interesting. So they put a lot of emphasis of trying to get this really nailed down for Drupal 8. And then they're all pretty active though. So it shows actually how recently they've been updated, and all of these communities are pretty active.
Can you say something about how you see Entity Construction Kit as being parallel, as being one of these subatomic things? Because it seems to me that it's like I never used it.
You could use it
at a higher level.
Yeah, you could use it for both. And so I know some places, I personally tend to prefer paragraphs these days, but there are some places which will make small entities, for reusable content, and then they'll use something called IEF, which is the inline editing form, in order to make it so that they can add another and edit those things. Yeah. So at the end of the day, it's pretty similar. One of the differences with using ECK and IEF, as a replacement or something similar to paragraphs, is with ECK you can make entities that you can use on different content. So it kind of depends on do you expect to reuse this content across other content? Or is this is this a standalone marketing page? Am I only going to use this content here? Or do I want to build this up and reuse this information elsewhere? If you want to reuse the information, you could use ECK or you could use blocks. So it kind of really depends on what is this stuff that you're putting in there, and conceptually, does it make sense, to stick it in a block or some other more structured thing. So this was a nice explanation of field collection versus paragraphs. It's like if you just have one type of thing and you want to add a bunch, yeah, field collection is fine. If you want to add different things, the first one, I want it to be my little spotlight, band, and the next one is going to be a 3-column band with, some sort of, teaser information or whatever. So if each thing is kind of its own, you get to pick and choose whatever, then paragraphs is great. Or you can use the ECK IEF model as well. But if it's basically just some really structured thing and I want to add one more of that same thing again and again and again, if it's, I'm going to add another, I have a UFO, thing, and it's like, it's going to have, it's add a UFO to my database, but I don't want to do a big structured content. I want to add a UFO to my UFO data to my marketing page for some reason. So then I could say, you can have, where I saw it, so location, and have the name of what I thought it was, maybe my name, that kind of thing. And I saw 3 of them that night. It was a busy night, so I had 3 of these things, and yeah, it was very productive. So,
Quick question.
yeah.
If I'm using workbench moderation, I've had trouble with field collection.
Yeah.
Not playing well with it. Does paragraphs play well with it?
Yeah, so that's actually, I think that was one of the reasons why the paragraphs folks started building paragraphs, was because long-standing problems with multilingual revisions, and then they had this limitation, we're just adding the same of this, thing, right? So they just okay, let's just step back and start over. So we've had better luck with those things. Again, you're going to have to test it with whatever, if you're on D7 or D8, and what version, and sometimes you have to use, the most latest, greatest version, and, so I won't say absolutely it's going to work for you, but there is a good chance it's going to work for you depending on what environment you're on. I have had a lot more luck. So in our example of our outerspacecadets.com, we had these flexible marketing pages. We wanted our marketing team to be able to just throw up whatever they want. Just make a new page. Maybe we'll have AdWords point to them. Maybe it's a PPC landing page or something, and we don't know what they want to put on it. So it can't be a structured page because we don't know what they want to put there. So that would be a great choice of still having a content type, but on that content type having some sort of flexible way of adding, these little structured bits of information. My preference is paragraphs, but like I said, some other places have used the ECK and IEF combination, especially if you want to be able to reuse that content throughout the site on other pages. But of course, there's always more. So we talk about going down the rabbit hole. So we could go down the black hole, and we could keep going and going. There's a lot more stuff, but some of the things that kind of fall into this realm would be showing related content, tools for that. And a lot of these tools are just built into Drupal 8 now. Building related content through taxonomy and view blocks, that kind of thing. There's also something in D7 node queue. If you had lists of content you want to show that somewhere, you can do that with entity queue in Drupal 8. So there's also something that, if you go, I think there was a talk at DrupalCon one of the last DrupalCons, maybe it was the European one, about content modeling, semantic content. So if you have things like reviews and people and that kind of thing, you might want to have use some of the schema.org related, modeling in order to be able to. It ends up putting markup into your content so that the search engines and other systems know that, oh, this is a review, this is a person, this is structured information that I know how to present this. I'm going to show stars on your Google search result because, I know what this thing is, and I know this was 4 stars out of 5. And, then there's the whole world of search engine optimization, which is, we did a training on Thursday. It was a whole day training on that. But, meta tag information that's part of the content, but it's something that isn't super visible to the user except through, search engines and stuff like that. So what do you use, right? And it depends. What are you trying to do? What are your requirements? Who's going to be editing stuff? Who's consuming it? So you have to think about it a lot and try to not just throw just start adding modules. You need to step back and do some planning and tinkering and stuff. I would say some people are saying, oh, well, I use field collection and paragraphs. Okay, I get it. I see why you might do that, but I think simplifying as much as possible, because each thing kind of has its own UI and way of interacting with it. And I think if you could just, if you really like using ECK and IEF, then why don't you stick with that, right? Don't do that and paragraphs and field collection or whatever, right? You want to try to keep things as clean as possible. So, pick your tool based on, playing around, try stuff out, right? Build something quick and have your content editor play with it. And they're like, okay, maybe that's not the best UX for you. Okay, maybe we should go and fine tune it. And know that, nothing is ever perfect. You do the best you can. Revisit trends regularly. Like we had, everybody was using a field collection, and then, like if you look at DrupalCon talks, all of a sudden there was like 6 talks, submitted for paragraphs. And you're like, what's this paragraphs thing that everybody's talking about, right? So there's always new things coming up, so you have to just keep your pulse on it, see what's going on. So at this point, I know we're running pretty long, but open up for questions.
So using ECK, you made a good point where you can take an entity, use it across other entities when you're displaying it, for example. Mm-hmm. How do you bring the two together? So if I want my new entity type to be included when I'm showing the other entity dynamically,
right?
Is that something views can handle? Can views handle pulling 2 different entities?
Yeah. So if you want to reuse that custom entity content across different content, then you're going to have entity relationships. So you have to have the point to it, right? So on whatever the host content, where you're going to show it, you're going to need to pull that entity in through a relationship, and then you can use views, or you can use a view mode on that. I mean, you can use display suite, you can pull that stuff in through panel. I mean, then we're going down the layout stuff, right? So how you might want to lay it out, and then that's a whole nother talk or more, several. Any other questions? I was like, lunch. Other questions? All right. Just a big plug for my son here, Aaron. He made some stickers. They're at our table. Hook for you too. If you go in the sponsor area, or in the left corner there. So that's one of the designs he made. But he has a NASA Drupal version, and also a robot. So he would like to share those with you if anyone likes stickers. But if there's no more questions, then have a good lunch, and thanks.